I'm Tyler, and today we're moving on to part 2 of game equations. Strap yourself in, do your YouTube chores down below, and I'll hit that intro to take us down the warp pipe. So the second part of this is going to break down into looking at, right now, the perspective. That's our next area, and after that we're going to be looking at some player count. So with perspective, there's going to be a couple different ways to look at a game, so to speak, and look at your experience in them. First up, we're going to have 2D games. These are obviously the easiest to understand. You're just kind of looking at a flat plane. So it's a game where you're controlling a character, usually left to right. Great examples are all of the amazing platformers from back in the day. Mario World, obviously. Donkey Kong Country, Rocket Knight Adventures, Sonic the Hedgehog. Pick one. But then you get into some of the other games that don't necessarily fit there. Stuff that's 2.5D. So this one's a little more hotly debated, I would say, but really for me, 2.5D is the beat 'em up genre. Stuff like Turtles in Time, Streets of Rage, Castle Crashers, Scott Pilgrim. These are all great examples of something that's 2.5D. So you're kind of stuck at that flat perspective, but you're able to move up and down as well as left to right. Kind of gives you some 3D elements to it, but without kind of full control. You're still sort of on a course. I don't know where Japanese RPGs like Chrono Trigger or the older Final Fantasy games would really fit in here. That's a discussion point, I would say, because they're kind of 2.5D because you're moving up and down, but I don't know, they also have a complete 2D look to them. But moving on, we get to a little more complicated stuff, and that's going to be where we're moving to the 3D realm, and you're looking at first, the first-person perspective. So these are generally synonymous with shooters, but there's also a lot of great puzzle games like The Witness that are in first person. This is really where you are the character in the game. There's also some games that will flip between perspectives, especially in 3D games. But a great example is something that primarily falls into the category that is next, and that's going to be third-person games, but the Batman Arkham series, more specifically Arkham Asylum, had a great section where it actually flipped you to an almost 2D perspective, and you were controlling Batman more or less left and right. It was more of a 2.5D, or at least flipping the camera so that you were looking at Batman this way, and you could still move him around in normal 3 dimensions. But third person is going to be behind the back, over the shoulder, or even pulled a bit further back. Stuff like Gears of War, Uncharted, Mario 3D games, so Mario 64, all the way up through Odyssey, Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. Kind of take your pick. It's the most common perspective nowadays. Getting from there, though, there's going to be some other perspectives that don't really get mentioned very often, but I debated moving these into one category or leaving them as two, and that's going to be top-down and also isometric. So they're kind of usually used for very similar type games, either twin-stick shooters or simulation strategy games, and a lot of games that used to be top-down have moved over to an isometric view now. Top-down games would be something like Hotline Miami, Geometry Wars, Asteroids, but you also have stuff like SimCity in there, at least the first iteration. When you move over to the next ones, you get isometric games. Those are your, again, a lot of twin-stick shooters and stuff like that. Stuff like Hellwalkers, or you get into SimCity 2000, 3000, obviously. Those are going to be isometric games. But Civilization, that's a great game that can be kind of categorized like that as well. You had this 2D perspective in the early games that was top down, and then you moved over to something that was isometric and eventually 3D, but keeping that isometric view. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the top-down games generally, but isometric games I actually really, really love. So I find it gives you a better detail, and a lot of games allow you to have different camera angles in more modern isometric games, meaning that they're not really isometric, but they're still categorized as that. Um, but that's just the basics of some of the perspectives that you can jump into. Moving on from there, we're going to get into player count. And this is something where it's gonna, again, very similar to perspective, break down into easy to understand sections. So first up, we're gonna have single player. That's gonna be obviously the easiest to understand. You're by yourself, you're playing it alone. It's usually a story game, or if you're playing an old school platformer, a lot of times, most of us, at least I know myself, being an only child, played them by ourselves. But you move on to the next category and you get into something that's really fun and something I've been enjoying a lot recently, and that's co-op games. So these are games where you're working towards an objective with someone else or a group of other people. So playing Borderlands right now, Borderlands 3, Ghost of Tsushima's multiplayer Legends mode works really good for that. But also even something like Mario World has a co-op mode. We'll get into the examples more later. I've already kind of spoiled that stuff for Mario World, but a lot of games do have multiplayer or co-op components to them nowadays, and in some cases, you're playing through the same thing that you were playing through before. So something like Castle Crashers or Scott Pilgrim, the extra person is really just there to add the fun into it, to enjoy something with someone else. But moving on from there, you get into going to be, I debated breaking these up or leaving them as one, very similar to the top-down or isometric, but I decided to break them up. And that's going to be multiplayer and then massively multiplayer. So going back to multiplayer, it's going to be when you're playing something with people. It sounds similar to co-op, but really multiplayer tends to be something that's more competitive. So you're not necessarily jumping in and playing something with other people, but also against other people. That's kind of, at least for me, where multiplayer falls into it. Technically, co-op is part of multiplayer as well, but that usually gets broken out into its own option in most games. Massively multiplayer, on the other hand, is something where you're joining into a server. The progress on that server is generally persistent with the world that exists there. So you're not turning the game on, you're joining into the game. That game exists whether you're there or not. A lot of games, like obviously World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, are massively multiplayer. Star Citizen is another example of this that's a more modern, if not completely finished game, but massively multiplayer, you're not going to know everyone you're playing with, as opposed to something like multiplayer where you can get to know everyone that's there. Or in the case of something like Onrush, I've definitely seen the same people in different games on different nights because it's got such a small community now, and I've been playing it a fair amount. So that kind of breaks down those. We'll get into the examples here again, even though I've spoiled some of them. So jumping in, obviously Mario World, that's going to be the perspective. Obviously it was 2D. Again, a two-tiered sort of example. It's a single player and a co-op game. So it's not that big of a deal mentioning those. But getting into Halo, that's where it gets really interesting. It's actually a first-person shooter, but it actually has third-person mechanics for the driving. So it actually fits into both a first-person and third-person category. Once you jump into the player count, though, it's a lot more of a mess, so to speak. You have almost every option there aside from massively multiplayer. So you're going to have single player, you're going to have co-op, and you're going to have multiplayer. So you get kind of your pick at what you want out of the experience. For me, Halo was always more of a play it once by myself, experience the story, and then replay it with some friends on an easier difficulty, just kind of running through and having some fun, or trying to get through one of the harder difficulties using co-op to kind of cheap out the checkpoint system. And then obviously the multiplayer is just a blast to goof around and play around on, especially back in the day when we didn't have as many games bombarding us with a million things to do and a million things to take up our free time. But that's a conversation for another video. Now, moving on to SimCity, this is where you're going to have a staunchly single-player game. There's some mods that exist out there, and specifically for the previous version, there was a network edition of SimCity 2000, but we're not talking about that one. So here it's strictly single player, and for the perspective, like I mentioned before, it is obviously isometric. This one was a quick video to cover, so I hope this keeps you kind of satiated. Next week, we'll get into the genre discussion, and that's going to be a complete big bag of worms. I hope that video doesn't go on too long, but I'll see you on Thursday for my thoughts. For that one, we'll be talking about difficulty in games. So until then, I'll see you guys on Thursday for my thoughts.